Well, hello, Adult Sunday School Leader. Thanks for tuning in this week. You know, the question of why is there suffering and evil in the world, that question has been around forever, and especially when bad things happen to good people. In 1981, Rabbi Harold Kushner wrote a New York Times bestseller book called When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And he wrote that after the loss of his son to a crippling disease. You know, there's a theological word for the question of evil and suffering in the world. It's called theodicy, and that's what we're going to be looking at this week. Now, those of you who have tuned into Prep Talk for some time now, that you know my wife's story. You know, I know we're all sinners. We all fall short of the glory of God, but my wife, Ruth, is a pretty good person. Humble, quiet, unassuming. Those are just a few of the terms I'd use to describe her, but she is definitely my better half. She's always been supportive of my ministry. In fact, in one of the pastor appreciation cards I got last Sunday, someone wrote thanking her for her contribution and that she and I make a great team. Well, in December of 2019, she was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer. And that announcement that we received in the hospital that morning, it was quite a shock to us. Later at a follow-up visit, we asked the surgeon about what kind of time frame were we looking at. And, you know, he teared up and he said he didn't understand why he could operate on drunk drivers or those involved in a gang shooting and they may come out with just a scar. And others, like Ruth, who weren't doing anything wrong, they were given a death sentence. His time frame, the surgeon's time frame, matched what the oncologist had said, which was she had about 2 years of life remaining. Well, fortunately, that's been almost 4 years ago. Well, the question of suffering is one that the author of Ecclesiastes, he also asked. He saw the righteous suffer and the wicked prosper. What's up with that? Why is there suffering in the world, especially with what I would call unwarranted suffering? We certainly can't answer that question to the satisfaction of everyone, but we're going to tackle it this week in the third lesson of the unit called Confident in the Face of Hard Questions. This lesson is called Why Do We Suffer? The focal passage is out of Job chapter 30 and chapter 42, and the point is we may not know why we are suffering, but God meets us in the suffering. So we're in the book of Job this week, and it's a story. It's a familiar story to us. The first three verses in the first chapter give a brief description of Job. He was a good man. In fact, he's called blameless and upright. He feared God. He shunned evil. Not only was he a godly man, but he was also wealthy. You know, those first few verses of Job 1 detail the thousands of animals that Job owned. He also had many servants. He was the greatest man in his area. And then tragedy struck. He lost all his animals to invaders and to a fire. All of his children were killed when the house that they were in collapsed on them. And all but a handful of his servants were killed. And all this happened on the same day. Well, Job's unlikely response was one of praise. He said, I came into this world with nothing. I'll leave with nothing. The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Then Job was afflicted with sores from his head to his toe, and that's when his loving wife gave him the advice of, why are you still keeping your integrity? Curse God and die. Now, do you ever wonder, like I do, why the only thing Job was left with, all his possessions, all of his family, except for this one wife, this wonderful woman who gives such poor advice, why was she the only one remaining? Well, I don't know. Well, in that culture, as well as in the culture of Jesus' time here on earth, the prevailing thought was that if you were prosperous and you were healthy, then you were in God's favor. But if you were poor, you had some kind of physical affliction, then it was the result of sin. We still see that today in some denominations and some thoughts, don't we? Oh, we see this in John chapter 9, verses 1 through 38. You know, that tells the story of the healing of the man born blind. And in chapter 9, verse 2 of John, Jesus' disciples asked him, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And of course, the answer was neither, but so that the works of God might be displayed in him. You know, Job's friends had the attitude that if all these things happened to Job, then Job must have committed some atrocious sin. For many chapters in the book of Job, the friends quizzed their friend Job, trying to figure out what he did wrong. And like Job, we all experience suffering to some degree. Sometimes we can see a direct correlation between an action and a consequence. When a lifelong smoker develops lung cancer, we aren't surprised. But when tragedy befalls someone who has not done anything wrong, has not done anything to deserve it, we're left with that question of why. And that takes us to our first set of scriptures, Job chapter 30, verses 26 through 31. And here Job defended himself in these verses to his friends. He did good. He looked for good. And what was the result? Evil and darkness. The suffering he experienced was the exact opposite of what he expected. There was not a positive correlation between who he was, which was righteous, and what he received, which was tragedy. We see here that Job's suffering, as well as ours, it affected all areas of his life. Job was affected physically. His skin was blackened. It's probably from the sores on his body, and he had fever. He also suffered emotionally. He said that he had become a brother to jackals and a companion to ostriches. Now that seems like an odd comparison to make. But here's the thing. Jackals, they make this ear-piercing wailing sound. Ostriches can scream dismally, as well as making this lowing sound, kind of like a cow. Both animals, they were known for being inhabitants of desolate places. Now these are true. These are unclean animals as well, but it's believed that the story of Job predates the giving of the law, so I don't know I'd put too much stock in the uncleanliness aspect of it. But the cries of these animals and their isolation were appropriate analogies as to how Job was feeling about himself. And psychologically, Job's hope had turned to despair. His outlook had become one of mourning and of wailing. A couple of questions that are in the leader guide, it'd be great to ask here, and that would be, what are some ways that people try to cope with suffering? Some possible answers would include seeking something or someone to blame, or escaping, like through drugs, alcohol, maybe other risky behavior. Another question is, what are some ways that we can prepare for seasons of suffering? Because we know it's going to happen to us, right? Well, in chapter 31, Job defends his life. He says, I've resolved not to look lustfully at women. Does God not honor that? I've been faithful in all my dealings. I've been generous to my servants and to the poor. I've trusted in God, not in possessions. I've not concealed any sin. And then in Job 31, verse 35, he states, I sign now my defense. Let the Almighty answer me. Let my accuser put his indictment in writing. Basically, Job is issuing his closing argument. I've been a good guy. The defense rests. Now, God, as the prosecutor, tell me what I've done to deserve this. Well, in Job 38, verse 4, God questioned Job by asking him, where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? And God continues for 4 chapters, basically stating in this whole time, I'm God and you are not. That takes us to Job's response. The first 3 verses of chapter 42. Job repented of his pride. Yes, God, you can do all things. Job admitted that he spoke using his limited earthly knowledge. God, I can't answer your questions. You are God and I am not. Who am I, a mere man, to question the architect and creator of the universe? Job acknowledged God's sovereignty. Now, what can we take away from just these few verses here? I think the main thing is we can't advise God on how to do his job. Now, I believe it's okay to honestly question God, like Mary did when she was told that she was going to give birth. She's a virgin. I've not been with any man. How can this be? That's just a question, okay? However, Job's questioning of God, it was more along the lines of being accusatory. It's like, I'm good and didn't deserve this. Now give me an explanation. Well, our last few verses of this week continue here in Job 42, verses 4 through 6. Job now has a new and different perception of God. He knows now to trust him and not question him. When he realized the holiness and the sovereignty of God, Job was then able to see himself in the light of who God was, and Job realized, He's just a created being, created from the dust of the ground. At this point, Job enters into a new relationship with God. So, why do evil and suffering exist? Well, ultimately, because of sin. God created a perfect world, and Adam and Eve lived in perfect harmony with God, but then sin entered the world. And from that point on, there's been suffering. The Bible's full of stories of unjust things happening to just people. The first example, of course, is the murder of the first couple's son, Abel. The greatest of injustices was the torture and execution of sinless Son of God, Jesus. If anyone didn't deserve what he received on earth, it would be Jesus. So we shouldn't expect any less. In Job's case, his suffering was a direct attack on his character by Satan. Our suffering may or may not have that same root cause. Even though Jesus told his disciples in John 16:33 that in this world you will have trouble, and in Matthew 10:22 that they would be hated by all, there was a direct correlation. The hatred that the disciples would encounter had a root cause. And that was since they were connected to Jesus and Jesus was hated, then they were going to be hated as well. But we can never fully answer questions like, if God is loving and all-powerful, then how could he allow blank to happen? And you can fill in that blank with so many things. But here's what we do know. Psalm 34:18 says that the Lord is close to the brokenhearted. So, like the point of the lesson states, we may not know why we are suffering, but God meets us in the suffering. Our response to suffering should be one of humility, like Job eventually had. Also, even as Jesus prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane that the suffering awaiting him not happen, when he said, let this cup pass from me, Jesus submitted to the Father's plan, to the Father's will. So I would encourage you to pray something like, Father, please take this away from me, but if you choose not to, somehow use my suffering for your glory. Now, something to tuck away in the back of your head here is Romans 8:28. That all things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. Now, that's something you don't need to go telling somebody who's suffering, okay? Somebody's lost a friend, somebody's lost a child, and you say, well, all things work together for good. Don't do that. So here's the thing. Not all things are good. Some things stink, but God can use those terrible things for good in the long run. I'll give you an example of that. We have a lady in our church whose grandson was killed in a automobile accident probably 15 years ago. The automobile was a car that this lady had bought for their grandson for his high school graduation. So he was killed in the car that they bought. And so, there's this guilt, there's mourning and all that stuff. But out of that, she began and continues occasionally a grief support ministry. So out of that tragic situation came good. Okay, was that a good situation? No, that was terrible. Would never want that to happen. But God can use that and eventually bring good out of that. And remember the promise of 2 Corinthians 4:17. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. The most horrendous suffering we can imagine on earth will be but really a faint memory for those who have Christ as their Savior. But we need to remember the flip side of that. That those same sufferings are just a foreshadow of the torment awaiting those who reject Christ's free gift of salvation. Next week is the first Sunday in November. It's the Sunday that we fall back and we gain that hour of sleep that we lost in the spring. So that's a great time to contact every member and every guest you've recently had in class and encourage them to enjoy the extra hour and then come on to Sunday school, where you'll be looking at, is Jesus the only way to God? Out of 1 John chapter 5. Now, I'm sure you've heard the saying, all roads lead to God. That's kind of a universalist approach. I've mentioned this before a couple of years ago in a prep talk, and you may or may not remember this, but just to get you thinking about the next week's lesson, I'm going to say that I believe that statement to be true. all roads lead to God. And no, I am not a universalist. So tune in next week and to see what I mean, okay? Well, thank you guys very much for watching. Thanks for your emails. Thanks for your YouTube comments. I do appreciate them. Don't forget, pray for and with your class.